All right. Well, good evening, good morning, wherever you are, everyone. Welcome to our WERN webinar, War Industry Resistors Network. Call ourselves WERN. Many of you have been with us before, probably. We've been doing these webinars just about once a month for almost 2 years now. This is our 21st webinar. And tonight is a very tense topic for many of us. Very crucial topic. We call it the selling of war with China. And, selling for two reasons, one of which is the American public being sold on having the war through a lot of misinformation. And the other is there's a lot of people going to make some money if we even now are making money as we prepare for war. But if we have another war like we do now and like we always seem to have, there's a lot of buying and selling that's going to happen. So what we normally do is we give you a little rundown on War Industry Resistors Network. Then I will introduce our two great presenters, and then we'll get started. I gave a little heads up on an email I sent out not too long ago that this particular webinar may be a little longer than our normal webinars. Normally, we try to stick to about an hour if we can, but we'll go longer on this one because there's a lot to say. So having said that, let me introduce our friend and colleague, Paul Shannon, to tell you about the War Industry Resistors Network.
Okay, well, thank you, Ken. Look at this great crowd. We have 102 people on the webinar already. Just to give people a little bit of background who don't know about us, the War Industry Resistors Network is, of course, a network of groups around the country who have as their goal taking our nation back from military contractors. Military contractors who, together with the fossil fuel barons, are bringing our country and our world to ruin. Along with groups all across the nation and the planet, we pursue a livable planet, human solidarity, and social and racial justice. But our specific focus is on U.S. military contractors and the real and present danger they pose. Each group in our loose network focuses on one or more military contractors operating in its community. If you have not yet done so, please join us by going to our website. Let's see, I want to put this link to the website in the chat. See if this works. There it is. And hope you'll go there, not just to look at the website, but there's a section on the website of all our previous webinars, or at least most of them. And if you have not seen some of these webinars are really something. And we've covered a million different topics related to military contractors. And I think you'll find going through those various past webinars will be very useful to you. Our next webinar, by the way, is September 27th. And this is going to be a very special webinar on how military contractors, through lobbying and especially through think tanks, how they create the war narrative, specifically how they create the war narrative regarding Ukraine. So that will be a very important webinar. We have Ben Freeman, who's one of the top people over at the Quincy Institute, and we have Don Obley from Open Secrets, the project that keeps track of political contributions. So he has some very interesting insights. So please note down September 27th. Brian, were you able to put that up already? The link to that. We'll be sending it out with the follow-up email to this anyway.
It's also right there in the chat, Paul.
Oh, great. Thank you, Brian. So that's going to be a good one. Ben has put out some incredible research on think tanks on the Quincy Institute website. So tonight, of course, we'll learn about how we are being mobilized for war with China and how military contractors benefit from this militarization of our society. And so we really want to thank Carl and Christian for being with us to share their research and their insights. So I know everyone's waiting to begin. Why don't we start, Ken?
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul. And so let me give you a quick introduction. If you don't know Carl Jha, and you can Google him or watch him on YouTube just about every day. He's on a lot. And Carl was born in China, but he grew up in China and the United States. He's a Caltech graduate. He is the host of the Silk and Steel podcast, and he focuses on China, history, culture, and politics. Christian Sorensen, many of you may know because he's been with us for a while. He's done a couple of webinars with us. He's on our board of advisors. Christian is an author and researcher focusing on the corporations that profit from war. He's a U.S. Air Force veteran. He's the author of a book, Understanding the War Industry. His work is available at his website, warindustrymuster.com, which I'll put in the link. I'll also put the link to Carl's podcast in the chat as well. And Christian has just started a Substack, and you can subscribe to it. It's called the Business of War Substack. So with no further ado, please, Carl, take us away.
Ken, thank you for inviting me. I'm honored to speak here to everyone present. How do I prepare a slide? Would I be able to share my slide? Let's see. Oh, yes, here we go. I can share, I guess, here we go. We'll just share my window. Okay, so let me do my Google slide here. The beginning of my slide, I chose this picture not because I'm a great fan of Richard Nixon, but because this was a pivotal point in history when Nixon visited China back in 1972. Because today we are also at an equally pivotal point. We are at the point where Congress is spending $500 million to spread anti-China propaganda. So the question is, how do we go from here to here? So I will try to provide a brief historical perspective. U.S. has always been deeply involved in East Asia from the very beginning, since the U.S. Waged the Spanish-American War to conquer Philippines, and then waged the Filipino-American War to keep Philippines. This cartoon basically sums it up. After all, the Philippines are only the stepping stone to China, because in the early 19th century, China was the world's largest economy. U.S., like every other European powers, were scrambling to get access to the Chinese market. And so this is an article from 120 years ago from the Atlantic, the breakup of China and our interest in it. This was written on the eve of the Boxer Rebellion, which U.S. also participated. U.S. Marines stormed the walls of Beijing and participated in the sacking. And so U.S. have a long colonial history in China. In fact, the U.S. maintained a 100-year-long Yangtze patrol on the Yangtze River. This is a picture of U.S.'s Panay in 1937 on the Yangtze River near Nanjing, shortly after it was sunk by the Japanese bombing. And in fact, there was a famous movie many of you are familiar with called The Sand Pebbles, which is based on the U.S. Yangtze patrol in China in the 1920s. Now, there was a sea shift in the Chinese perception of U.S. and Americans during World War II, because during World War II, the two are allies. And the Chinese people really appreciated the help that they have received from the Americans. So all the old colonial image of Europeans and Americans were wiped clean in one clean slate. And just when it looks like the two nations are about to embark on a more cooperative relationship, something happened. That was the Chinese Civil War, because for the U.S. post-World War II plan, U.S. had intended for China to be its junior partner or its chief client state in East Asia, but that plan didn't come to fruition because the communists won the Chinese Civil War, and Mao declared the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949. And then Korean War broke out. As soon as the Korean War broke out, Sherman authorized the Seventh Fleet to sail into the Taiwan Strait to prevent Mao's People's Liberation Army from crossing into Taiwan and directly intervene in the Chinese Civil War. And of course, that led to the U.S. CIA sent advisors and flooded Taiwan with weapons. And that directly led to the Chinese intervention in the Korean War several months later in October that year. And U.S. actually had this concept called the First Island Chain, which stretched from the islands of Japan all the way down to Taiwan and Southeast Asia to contain the spread of communism from Soviet Union and China. And then fast forward to 1972, U.S. decided to exploit the Sino-Soviet split. That's when Nixon went to China, met with the Chinese leader Mao and Zhou Enlai, and where Nixon signed the Shanghai Communique, which formed the basis of the Sino-American relationship going forward. And the essence of Shanghai Communique is that United States acknowledged there's only one China and that Taiwan is part of China. And U.S. does not challenge that position. Now, this became what's known as one China policy, which has been the bedrock of the Sino-American relation ever since. Now, fast forward a few years down the road, the Cold War is over. And then so that also means the U.S.-China relationship faced another sea shift, because the underlying reason for the quasi-U.S.-China alliance was in the 1980s and late 70s was to be against Soviet Union. And the U.S. military-industrial complex to continue its, in order to justify the continued spending, they came up with the China threat, hoping China would fulfill the role of boogeyman that Soviet Union was. And this is a number of annual articles on China threat from the collapse of the Soviet Union to 2006. Now they stop at 2006 because if we do that in present day, this will go off the chart. And there's another sea shift is the rise of the Chinese economy. Now, in the purchase power parity terms, China is already world's largest economy, and that made many in the U.S. elite deeply uncomfortable. So for a long time, there have been two camps in U.S. when it comes to what to do with China. On the one side, you have the U.S. business who want to go exploit the Chinese market and the vast pool of Chinese labor, and there's the so-called China lobby. And then you have the containment camp, which is a U.S. Pentagon. U.S. Pentagon always has a boner for containing China, but in the more recent years, that balance started to shift. This is a chart of the so-called fan or the U.S. economy, increasingly financialized U.S. economy now is increasingly dominated by big tech companies. And all these big tech companies, Facebook, Meta, and Alphabet, Google, they're not in China. They're not in China because of their own choosing, but which means they have no stake in China, but they're also deeply embedded with the Pentagon. They're part of, now it's no longer the military industrial complex. Now it's the military industrial congressional intelligence media academia think tank complex. And the big tech is deeply part of that. And this led to the US chip war on China, which is pushed by ex-Google CEO Eric Schmidt. Eric Schmidt himself have AI startup, which has a lot of contract with the Pentagon. And his idea is that we must stop China from progressing on AI and developing Skynet before we do. So this is why we must sabotage the Chinese tech industry by placing a global ban on their semiconductor industry. And there's a problem. Of course, there's the rest of the American economy is still deeply embedded with the Chinese economy. So this is where the idea of decoupling come from. The way they went about this, first they start with a human rights angle. This is where the Uyghur, so-called Uyghur genocide issue that's been pushed by the U.S. media complex come from. Now the Uyghur people live in the northwestern part of China in the region called Xinjiang. Now it's a very strategic region. It's part of the China's Belt and Road Initiative. You can see from the map, the land route of the Belt and Road Initiative has to go through Xinjiang to reach Central Asia, West Asia, East Europe, etc. Now, the United States decide to weaponize the Uyghur issue against China, first by claiming there's human rights abuse, and then they claim there's mass internment, and then they claim there's slave labor. So they started to push the U.S. multinationals to boycott goods from Xinjiang, and that started a whole chain of started a chain reaction of U.S. government basically requiring U.S. multinationals to move their supply chains out of China. Now, the whole logic of decoupling is that U.S. and Chinese economy are too deeply enmeshed that if a conflict breaks out, it will hurt U.S. as equally as it hurts China. So what we got to do is preemptively cut those ties so we can confront China in East Asia. I think I'm gonna this is the rest of my slide. I know we're trying to leave time for Q&A later, so I'm gonna yield my time to Christian.
All right, Christian.
All right, giddy up. Let's see if I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound good.
All right,
Yes.
huge. Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Paul. All right, that was excellent, Carl. Thank you so much. I've seen you present before, but every time I learn more. So, excellent work. I'm going to be speaking about U.S. militarization of the Pacific. So U.S. foreign policy is generally focused around two goals: protect and promote capitalism, that is to say, mostly Western-based multinational corporations, and to profit from conflict, hot and cold. And that's where the military-industrial complex comes in. That's what I study. I study the business side of things. Funding. The U.S. military has many different funds to use when contracting with industry. Some of the more popular funds are operations and maintenance, research, development, test and evaluation, procurement, military construction, on and on. On top of this, Congress has created entirely new funding buckets to militarize entire regions. As the European Deterrence Initiative has militarized Eastern Europe since 2014, the Pacific Deterrence Initiative has been militarizing the Pacific since 2020. Now, obviously, the military-industrial complex and the U.S. ruling class more narrowly cannot say we are on the offensive, we are aggressive. It always has to be deterrence. It always has to be self-defense. Okay, these are euphemisms, and we must reject these outright. So these two initiatives focus on collecting information, building up military infrastructure, putting weaponry in place, smoothing out logistics, making sure stuff can get from point A to point B, and getting allies on board. getting the ruling classes in other countries on board. So US bases in the Pacific, mostly the result of old World War II infrastructure. The US military began its current buildup in the Pacific after the Obama administration announced the pivot to Asia, and that was in November of 2011. By 2018, the US National Defense Strategy had listed Moscow and Beijing as the top enemies. Now, it doesn't use those words, it doesn't use bad guys, it doesn't use enemies. It will use words like strategic competitors, stuff like that. We must know our geography. We're not very good with geography in this country, but we must know it. This is probably the most famous map that's been circulating. I added the flag to Hawaii here to round it out. I don't believe this map is up to date as of at least 2022, but you get the general idea. There's one aggressor in this equation. So the U.S. military runs on fossil fuel. It runs on fossil fuel. Therefore, militarizing the Pacific requires constant repair and building new fossil fuel infrastructure. These are just a handful of the many contracts that I've seen in my study of Pentagon contracting announcements. Let you look at that for a little bit. There's some more. All right, so corporations build up the military infrastructure and they run a lot of US military activity. I'll take you through a few case studies: South Korea, Okinawa, Japan, Philippines, and Guam. These are just a few of the countries involved. Obviously, Australia is involved as well. South Korea. All right. So this is a crude diagram of some of the larger US military installations in South Korea. Oh, what do you know? The war industry. Hello. You should know Boeing. You should know General Dynamics. You should know Northrop Grumman. You should know RTX. That's the new name for Raytheon. They recently rebranded. And you should know L3Harris. Those are some of the big guys. But you should also know all these others. Amentum is owned by private equity. KBR got infamous during the Iraq War, still around. SAIC does a lot of information technology, a lot of intelligence work, actually. Most US intelligence work, by the way, involves computers. It's people sitting at desks. It has nothing to do with cloak and dagger stuff. It has nothing to do with meeting people in the alley at 4 in the morning. It's mostly people at computers. And here's what industry does. I'll let you look at that. These, by the way, these examples, these case studies, these are just a sprinkling of the contracts, just to give you a general idea. Okay, it's based on recent contracting announcements. And it's just to give you an idea. These are not comprehensive by any means. I've also deliberately excluded some of the larger goods and services, like the major aircraft carriers that cost $12.6 billion now per aircraft carrier. I've not included some of the larger aircraft, that kind of thing. All right, Okinawa. Okinawa is incredibly militarized. It's not just the bases. It's also the training areas in the air and in the sea that the US military has cordoned off. Okay. The jail cells represent, very crudely, US military installations. And there you go. Industry's there. The US military cannot shoot, move, communicate, let alone spy or do anything without industry. And there's what they do. FGS, Intel, CTC, energy projects, Cobham makes the drogue, basically the big tube that refuels aircraft, and on and on. You'll see some of the same corporations pop up because the big six are everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. Philippines. This is the Philippines you know and love. Oh, industry. Momentum, RTX. Ericsson does transportation. J&J and JLL have a joint venture. They do base operations. At U.S. military bases in the U.S. and particularly overseas, the military doesn't run the base anymore. It used to back in the day. For example, during U.S. aggression against Vietnam. Okay, the U.S. military ran most bases there. These days, following the neoliberal consensus that most government activity should be handed over to corporations, the military has done the same thing. So most military activity is in the hands of corporations, including such basic stuff as running the base. Vertex recently, you see on the right-hand side of the screen, Vertex recently merged with Vectrus. So now they're called V2X, and they're a top 25, 30 war corporation. So how does the US government co-opt the country? It usually does all 6 of these things. Give that government money for infrastructure, military infrastructure. Offer training, military training. Let the US war industry sell to them. Euphemisms, of course, always euphemisms. We can't just say, hey, we want to run the show, we want to own you. We have to say, shared interest, interoperability, that kind of stuff. And you see the rest. The US government has something called an Advanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. Basically a fancy way of saying military agreement. In April of this year, the US government expanded that in cooperation with Manila. The EDCA, signed 2014 under President Barack Obama, allows US access to Philippine bases for a variety of activities. Then in the expansion this year, the US got access to new bases. Here's the BBC coverage, points out where the bases are located. You see Taiwan up in the north, you see China right there, or mainland China. I cannot stress this enough. There's one aggressor here. It's not Beijing trying to pry off Long Island from the United States. Okay, it's not Beijing interfering with a dispute between, Georgia and Florida, or South Carolina and North Carolina. Okay, it is the U.S. government doing that in an internal Chinese dispute. What do you know? U.S. Department of Defense plans to allocate over $100 million by the end of the fiscal year 2023 toward infrastructure investments in the Philippines. What could your town do with $100 million? There's never enough money for healthcare. There's never enough money for debt relief. There's never enough money for decent education, infrastructure, anything. But they always have another 100 million, another billion for war. Always. These are the priorities of the US ruling class. These are their priorities. Not to mention compensation for all the victims of the US government overseas. Sound familiar? This is the exact same stuff that the US government was doing in Eastern Europe prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Prior to that. It didn't happen in a vacuum. All right, we're at Guam now. We must know that where this is located. On the far left of the screen, you see the Marianas Islands. At the south of that is Guam. Satellite picture of Guam and the war industry. In the northeast is Andersen Air Force Base, which is one of the larger installations on the island. And in the west is Naval Base Guam. Now, there are other U.S. facilities on the island, but those are the 2 biggest. And of course, the war industry is there. Here's what it does. You see Aptim doing petroleum systems maintenance. Raytheon's, of course, there with communications gear, infrastructure, antenna, Lockheed Martin's Aegis missile system is on the island. Northrop Grumman has hardware and software for communicating with satellites. On and on and on. Again, this is not comprehensive. This is just from recent contracting announcements. What's in Guam's future? Well, according to the Navy, a lot more construction. A lot more construction. This is as of March of this year. All of this stuff is queued up, planned years ahead of time. Another slide, same thing. Even more construction, more construction, more construction. They bid on this stuff. And it's also important to note that the US government will throw a local corporation a bone here or there. Okay, so local business will get some business. When the US is building military infrastructure in the Middle East, it will include a corporation that's based in Jordan. Okay, sometimes they even lean on Turkish corporations as well. Same thing when there was militarizing Eastern Europe for the past 2 decades. It will throw a bone, a contract to a Polish firm. Okay, sometimes a firm from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, same thing. Okay, and it does that in Guam as well. Sales to allies is the final piece of this whole thing. All right, I'm just going to give you a sample from June and July. June and July. It's just a sample. Sales to Japan. All right. Aegis test sites, development and operation and maintenance. Raytheon missiles. More Raytheon missiles, upgrades, different type of missile. A networking system made by Boeing for ships. Sales to South Korea. Work on the Aegis system, Raytheon missiles, maintenance on certain Boeing aircraft, surveillance aircraft, Boeing ship networking system as well, a launcher made by Lockheed Martin that's on many different ships, on and on and on. Lockheed missiles. Sales to Taiwan, of course. Lockheed Martin maintenance and training for F-16 jets, General Dynamics logistics in Taipei. Lockheed Martin missiles. This is just a drop in the bucket. This is just a drop in the bucket. It is a sample from just 2 months this summer. Of course, Australia is buying stuff left and right. Oh, what do you know? What's this? Northrop Grumman opens Taipei office. August 17th, 2023 press release. Northrop Grumman has opened an office in Taiwan to accelerate access to the company's technologies and strengthen partnerships with customers and local industry. Oh, it just sounds so lovely. It sounds very harmless. What could possibly be going on? By the way, at that point, I should note that all of the major war corporations, the big 5, the big 6, they have representatives in Taiwan. Okay, they have either offices, or they have subsidiaries that operate there, or they have local officials that operate on their behalf. What's known as, or at least used to be known as, a comprador, basically a local official that works, that knows the area, that gets a decent slice of money to work on behalf of the American big business interests. So what can we conclude? First of all, the US ruling class doesn't care about you, does not care about the American public. It tells you time and time again, every single day, there's plenty of money for war, optional, elective, endless war. But there's not enough money for you, not enough money for your hometown. There's plenty of money to go around. It's not for stuff that helps people. Again, let alone money to compensate all the victims of the military-industrial complex overseas. Capitalism is an economic system wherein the workers create the profit and the ruling class takes the profit. That often comes in the form of dividends to shareholders, executive compensation, stock buybacks, etc. Capitalism is not democratic because the workers have no say in the business decisions. The capitalists, known as executives, make those decisions. Capitalism is also not democratic because the resources that the US ruling class summons, including but not limited to lobbyists and campaign finance, drown out your vote at the ballot box. You are free to vote. But if your vote doesn't align with the interests of the US ruling class, you are not going to get your way. Case in point, universal health care. Overwhelmingly popular in the United States. The American public wants universal health care. You are not going to get it. There's way too much money to be made in healthcare. As long as this economic system is here and the military-industrial complex is here, the wars will continue. Like Carl said, China's the boogeyman today. There were plenty of boogeyman before, and there will be plenty of boogeyman afterwards, if we as a species make it out of this one, which is pretty hairy, giving ecosystem collapse and potential nuclear war on multiple fronts. Okay. If there's one thing I can stress in conclusion, workers must realize that the enemy is not some boogeyman overseas. It's not the bad guys that you think are in, Iran or Venezuela or Cuba or any of the bad guys, let alone Russia or, China. Okay. The wars end when we, the people, say they end. That's it. Thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Christian, and thank you, Carl. And before we get to the open Q&A, I want to prompt Carl one prompt here to get you to talk a little bit more, Carl, about the relationship between Taiwan and the People's Republic of China. And I've heard you do this. I mean, you don't need to go as deep as I know you can. You're quite an historian. But of course, the understanding that we've been given, the misinformation we've been given, is that almost as though Taiwan's a separate country. It's going to get invaded by China. We're there to protect a separate country from this nasty invader. And we know that's not true, but many people don't. Can you speak to that issue a little?
Yes, Taiwan has been part of China since at least the 1600s, and after 1895, after Japan defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War, China was forced to give up Taiwan, cede the territory of Taiwan to Japan. So Japan had a colonial rule on Taiwan for 50 years, from 1895 to 1945, similar to Japanese colonization of Korea. Now, in 1945, as per the Potsdam Declaration, Japan had to give up all the territory I have acquired by conquest prior. That included Taiwan. So Taiwan reverted back to Chinese sovereignty in 1945. And what happened then is the Civil War broke out on Chinese mainland, and the communists won the Civil War, and the former government under Chiang Kai-shek, they fled to Taiwan, where they established their base there. And it's during this time in 1950, when Mao was about to order the People's Liberation Army to cross the Taiwan Strait, that's when Korean War broke out in June 1950, and that's when Truman orders U.S. 7th Fleet to enter the Taiwan Strait, directly intervene in the Chinese Civil War. So the Taiwan issue is a legacy of that U.S. decision back in 1950s. It's a result of unfinished Chinese Civil War. But both sides, the government on both sides of the Taiwan Strait affirm there's only one China, but they just each claims to be the sole representative of all of China. So in fact, the government on Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek had occupied China's UN seat until 1971, when it was thrown out and the seat reverted to People's Republic of China. So this is a claim of legitimacy between two rival governments, rather than a separate national question. And although in the more recent years, it was encouragement from U.S., there has been a separatist movement on Taiwan, which says, we'll just want to declare de jure independence. But the vast majority of people on Taiwan actually prefer status quo, which is, they get to live the life they have always been. And the danger today is that U.S. also knows Taiwan is a red button issue for China. As long as China is okay with Taiwan maintaining status quo, which means separate, but still maintain that it's part of China. However, if Taiwan do declare de jure independence, that could bring Chinese military intervention. Now, U.S. fully knows this, and the danger is that U.S. might just go for that button to provoke a war with China, because let's face it, the people on Taiwan, they will not do anything without explicit backing, approval, encouragement of the United States. This is very clear. So really, the ball is in the U.S. court on how far they want to escalate the tension with China.
Good. Thank you, Carl. So we're going to open it up to Q&A, but again, before we do, we'd like to take an action. And we've been the past few webinars, we have actually tried to do something, not just speak about the issue. So Brian Garvey with Mass Peace Action has set us up to do that. And Brian, if you would introduce and get us on that.
Sure, absolutely. So like Ken said, one of the things that we've been trying to do as part of our WORN webinars and as part of our webinars with Mass Peace Action as well is to take some action right during the program. We'll send it out again in a follow-up email, but we all know how our inboxes can get. Sometimes you might miss the email from us, so we're going to take a minute, and it really only takes a minute. Maybe you could probably even get it done in about 30 seconds. To click the link that I just put in the chat, and that will take you to a page. It'll ask you for your address or your zip code. And this is just for people who are here in the United States. It'll ask you for your zip code, so it can then tell who your senators are and who your member of the House of Representatives is. And it will send them a quick message basically telling them that you oppose this path to war between the United States and China, that the Washington establishment is taking us down. You'll also see a pretty great political cartoon that was drawn up by a former co-op student of ours named Drew Flaherty. And it's just a two-panel cartoon, but I think it pretty much says it all in terms of the partisanship in Washington and how they seem to get along on this issue of war with China. I'll put it on the screen right now. Yeah, they fight like cats and dogs, but when it comes to a plan to try and dominate the Indo-Pacific region and do everything possible that they can to prepare for a war between the United States and China, they get along pretty well. So if you can just take a minute to fill this out, these are my reps right here, and just dash off a message. Washington, D.C. needs to know that we oppose this path to war between the U.S. and China. So I thank you in advance for taking action.
Great. Thanks, Brian. And it doesn't even take a minute. I just clicked on it, click, and it was done. And did it while you were speaking, Brian. So thanks. Okay, so we're going to do questions and answers. And both Carl and Christian said they're ready to stay a while if you want to talk a while. The way we do it is you can see that Paul here has his hand raised. And if you haven't done this with us before, you go to the reactions button that's on my screen, is down below on the bottom of the screen, and you click there, and one of the options to react is to raise your hand. And you get that little icon there up in the corner of your screen. And we take people one at a time. We ask you to, if you have a comment, to keep it brief, and please have a question so we can go back to Carl and Christian and get them to talk to us some more. So please, sometimes people want to give speeches. Let's not do that. Let's let Carl and Christian give the speeches. So Paul, you've got your hand up there. You want to go first?
Sure. Carl, you mentioned the Uyghur situation, which is one of many things going on in the world, but it's become very, very significant in terms of putting a wedge between the U.S. and China, and especially of gathering human rights groups' support for U.S. policy. So I think it is kind of important to understand it a little bit. I just wondered if you could quickly give your take on just what the Uyghur situation is and how bad the situation is, or whatever, even though we know that it's being used to ramp up anti-China feeling.
Right. I mean, even as far as back in 1990s, U.S. intelligence agency and think tankers have already talking about weaponizing Uyghur issue against China. So the Uyghurs are ethnic Turkic ethnicity that lives in the northwestern Xinjiang region of China. They have a very distinct ethno-religious and linguistic identity from like the majority of Chinese. And so this is why Xinjiang is actually not a province. The full name is Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which means the head of Uyghur Autonomous Region must be Uyghur. And the official language is both Mandarin and Uyghur. And so what happened in Xinjiang was there was in the 1979, this was during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. At that time, CIA actually had a listening station in Xinjiang to monitor the Soviet nuclear testing in neighboring Kazakhstan. But CIA also was working with the Saudi and the Pakistani authorities to arm the Afghan Mujahideens to send them across the border to destabilize Afghanistan. And to hide their tracks, they decided CIA purchased tons of Chinese-made weapons because the Chinese-made weapons, they are closer to the Soviet design. And they would source them to carry those weapons into Afghanistan, because Afghanistan have a severe lack of roads. They needed a transportation tool. So first they sourced mules from Tennessee. This is probably some senator's pet project. But the Tennessee mules couldn't hack the severe Afghan climate. Many of them died. So CIA actually purchased a lot of donkeys and mules from Xinjiang to carry those Chinese-made weapons for the Afghan Mujahideens into Afghanistan. Now, in 1979, a road was built between China and Pakistan, the Karakoram Highway. So not only goods travel on the road, but also people. In late 1970s, that's when China first started to go through its open and reform period. Chinese people after Cultural Revolution are finally allowed to travel abroad again. So many Uyghurs also travel on the Karakoram highway to Pakistan. Now, some of the young Uyghur men ended up in the bordering regions between Afghanistan and Pakistan, where the Saudis have funded this series of religious schools called madrasas to indoctrinate Afghan refugees with fundamentalist ideology, and which is part of the CIA project Cyclone, which was at that time CIA's largest project to destabilize Afghanistan. So some of the Uyghur ended up in those madrasas. They got radicalized, and some of them even went across the border to fight in Afghanistan. Now, in 1989, the Soviet withdrew from Afghanistan. The civil war continued in Afghanistan, but some Uyghur fighters start to come back to Xinjiang. I came to United States in October 1990, but in the early I think it was February 1990, there was a Baran County incident in Xinjiang where some of these Uyghur Mujahideens, they came back and they tried to they organized attacks against the Chinese government installations and the police installation. So this is start kind of low-level insurgency in Xinjiang from 1990s, but it intensified around late 90s and early 2000s, and that culminated in the 2009 Urumqi riots, in which more than 200 people, around 200 people were killed and over 2,000 people were injured. When it was back in 2009, a lot of the US social media were actually not banned in China. You could access Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, everything. But a lot of these Uyghur diaspora group funded by NED, National Democracy, NED, National Endowment for Democracy, which is another CIA cutout organization. So they start to spread a lot of rumors online about another separate mass incident down in Guangdong province. And that incited the mobs in Urumqi, in the capital of Xinjiang region, to riot. So after 2009, after the result of Urumqi riots, there was a big crackdown from security crackdown in Xinjiang. The borders of Xinjiang start to close off, but the terrorist attack continue. In 2014, there was attack on Tiananmen Square, a radicalized Uyghur family that drove their van to plow down pedestrians on Tiananmen Square. And then in March 1st, 2014, there was an incident of attack in Kunming train station. And so these series of incidents finally led to in 2017, that's when Chinese government start to establish a series of de-radicalization centers in Xinjiang. This is what's been labeled as concentration camp in the Western press. And the report about supposedly 1 million Uyghur being held in concentration camp came from two sources. One is the Human Rights Defender, China Human Rights Defender, another NED founded group, and the Victim of Communism Foundation, the researcher Adrian Zenz. And the way they arrive at the number 1 million Uyghur held is that, according to the China Human Rights Defender group, which I read the report, they supposedly interview 8 villagers from 8 separate villages in the rural Kashgar area. And based on their testimony, and they estimated 10% of their villagers in these villages have been sent to these de-radicalization centers. And so they extrapolated to the whole or entire Xinjiang population, about 11 million Uyghur. So that's where they get the 1 million Uyghur in concentration number. And then that story being propagated through all of the mainstream media, and that later gets turned into, Chinese government is going to apply final solution to this Uyghur people. Then it became Uyghur genocide. Now the idea of the de-radicalization center in Xinjiang was so that people can be reintegrated into society. So that included vocational training, to train them in a certain skills. So when their time to reintegrate them back into society, they will be able to find jobs. Now that has been spun as the Chinese using Uyghur slave labor, and this is how they use that narrative to push for the decoupling. They first try to shame Western multinationals for not sourcing, for example, Xinjiang cotton and also Xinjiang tomatoes. So for a while, Xinjiang was one of the major tomato growing regions in China, and one a fifth of the the ketchup that was made in that consuming United States. Fifth of the ketchup was sourced from Xinjiang. So they started to cut those ties because as I said earlier, there was a campaign to decouple from China, and the Uyghur issue become very convenient because this is about human rights. This is about the genocide. It's about genocide. We cannot compromise on genocide. And the fact is, from 2017, the deradicalization the program started in 2017, ended in 2019. So at the end of 2019, all these deradicalization centers have been closed. And so, but we are still being told as if there's still some kind of ongoing genocide in Xinjiang with millions of Uyghur being held against their will. So this is my take. If you have any further question, I will address them as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a lot of detail. That was quite a history lesson. Thank you so much. Okay, so let's go to the hands raised. I see Donald Smith. Go right ahead, Donald.
Yeah. Okay. I have two quick questions. Americans are divided about the war in Ukraine, but you think that that the media and most people would say, "Hey, we don't really think it's a good idea to have war with China." But so it's just amazes. I mean, I'm disgusted that people are duped about the war in Ukraine, but it's even more amazing that they're duped about China because it's such an obviously a stupid idea, and so blatant that we're surrounding them. And the second question is, Christian. This is correct. Christian said he blamed capitalism, and I just wanted to point out that some people can be anti-war, but maybe not socialist or not anti-capitalist. So that's all I wanted to say.
Okay.
No disagreement in that. You can absolutely be against war and have different political ideologies, different economic ideologies. However, it is undeniable that the U.S. ruling class profits from war and will not stop profiting from war until the American public rises up and says enough is enough. I mean, they commodified, the US ruling class has commodified every aspect of life in the United States: healthcare, food, housing, everything. And then on top of that, they price gouge you. So you have to choose between housing and buying your medicine. I mean, enough is enough. Enough is enough.
Anything from you, Carl?
And completely agree. I mean, I think it doesn't matter what your ideology is. I think we should all agree, waging war across the globe is a bad idea. I mean, U.S. do not, as Christian has made very clear, what U.S. government is doing right now is they're doing military Keynesianism. It's like, you want socialism? The best we can do is war. and this is, it's very sad because if you look at what's made in U.S. nowadays, it's true. We just have OnlyFans and military industries. That's it. This is what the system has gotten us today, and the system needs to change.
Thank you. All right, I see Elizabeth. Is it Fatah? You're next, Elizabeth.
All right, thank you. I've asked this question in several of these webinars, and that is the ruling class. They're not stupid. And why is it they don't understand about global climate change and the whole question of nuclear war? I mean, what is their end game here? That's what I want to know. Do you think of their end game?
I don't know if I can completely agree with they're not stupid, but I think they're very smart about lining their own pockets. They're very smart about grift, but they're also at the same time can be very short-sighted. And they I mean, I don't think they even worry about global climate change. Most of them their goal is probably retire with their ill-gotten gains and live comfortably in retirement in Bahamas. And they probably weren't thinking that Bahamas might be gone with rising sea level. You know, but the nuclear war, I think there's so much hubris and American exceptionalism that they think, you know, no matter how they walk all across Russia or China's red line, that the other side would not respond because they believe so much in the American power. You know, that's why when you know, even though they made a verbal agreement with Gorbachev not to push NATO eastward in 1989, they still went ahead and anyway, even though all the Russian experts, including George Kennan, who's the architect of the containment strategy against the Soviet Union, said this expansion of NATO is a bad idea, but they still do it because NATO as a bureaucracy needs reason to justify its existence. And when you're talking about institutions like NATO, then you are talking about jobs and career at stake. And this is how I think that's explained in large part about motivation with these people. It's all about jobs and careers and screw with the consequences. You know, they might not live long enough to see that. And about the nuclear war, I don't think they planned for a nuclear war. I don't think they want a nuclear war. They just want to increase the tension as much as possible so they can keep on selling weapons, like Christians has shown. You know, that's their really end goal, is to maximize the industrial the military industrial complex. But you know, sometimes their action will have blowback. You know, Ukraine is a perfect example. But they apparently haven't learned their lesson. They think they can still, you know, walk all over China's red line on Taiwan. Right now, you know, what's holding us back from World War III is actually the Chinese government being rational and being the actual adult in the room and not take the bait.
I'd just add that, so who is this ruling class? Okay, who are these people? They're the top corporate executives at the largest U.S. corporations, number one. They are financial tycoons sitting in hedge funds, private equity firms, and the largest financial firms, Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, JP Morgan Chase, okay? Then they're the elected officials and the judges who are owned by those prior two groups. And then there are also the top bureaucrats, the 4-star generals and admirals who are about to retire and go join the war industry to make their 6 figures, 7 figures a year, okay? So now that you know who these people are, think of the sociopathy that is required to ascend to that level. Think of the sociopathy, okay?
Yeah.
Lack of empathy, deceit, self-importance, duplicity, inability to feel remorse, okay? These people do not care about the natural world. They do not care about climate change. They do not care about their great-grandkids or their grandkids. They care about themselves and the short-term maximization of profit. That's it, okay? And they are leading us down, as we all know, they're leading us down ecological disaster. Ecosystems are collapsing. Scientists tell us that we're in the 6th mass extinction. And then in parallel to that, there is a changing climate that the fossil fuel industry and our use of fossil fuel has exacerbated. That's it.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, right on. See, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more hands. Let's see if we can get through these 5 folks here. Looks like Quanta is the next person. No, I'm sorry. Joanne, you're the next person. There you are. Go right ahead.
Oh, thank you. Yes, this has been a marvelous session for both of you. Well, you raised issues of nuclear war, but you hear about the escalation of the Chinese nuclear production. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I can. So China has 300, estimated 300 nuclear weapons, and China also have a no public stated it has a no first strike policy, which means China will not use nukes first. Now, United States do not have such policy. In fact, U.S. think tankers they have openly talking about how to use what they call tactical nuclear weapons. It's no open secret. They've been talking about what would happen if, say, China sinks a U.S. aircraft carrier, and that might necessitate U.S. respond with tactical nuclear weapons. Right now, there's no nuclear parity. U.S. has far more nukes than China. Russia has a little more, but like this is reason now. U.S. is also putting on so-called missile defense all over the Asia Pacific Rim. They put in South Korea. They call the THAAD system. And the idea is that if they put those missile defense system closer to China, they can intercept any missiles coming from China before they will threaten, say, for example, continental United States. So U.S. is working on to blunt the edge of China's nuclear deterrent, and this is what's driving Chinese expansion of their nuclear arsenal. My guess is that they will probably try to reach parity with the United States in the coming decades.
Whoa.
And I'd just add to that first of all, that was great. The U.S. government is the only government to use nuclear weapons, first and foremost. The U.S. government is also in the middle of taking over 1.5 trillion of your tax dollars and revamping its submarine-based nuclear weapons, its land-based nuclear weapons, and the bombs that it drops from aircraft. Okay, that's money that could be going to programs of social uplift. This is a direct message from the U.S. ruling class that it doesn't care about you, the American public, and it's going to spend its money. It's going to spend your tax dollars on things that benefit the U.S. ruling class and the 1% of the 1% that own most stock. Okay, now if a country, China, Iran, any of these so-called bad guys, does nothing in the face of U.S. government aggression, then the military-industrial complex says, hey, all right, look, they're cowards. Let's ramp it up. And then, on the other hand, if a country does something, reacts, as China has done in reacting by building its own modest nuclear arsenal, then the military-industrial complex says, see, their aggression. Look at that aggression. We gotta go full speed ahead. So countries can't win.
Yeah.
Nobody wins with this arrangement. Nobody wins. Sorry to get all amped up.
You win if you build your own nukes. I mean, look at the example of Gaddafi versus North Korea. Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, and North Korea, they all had their own nuclear program, but Saddam and Gaddafi gave up their nukes. North Korea didn't. North Korea is not in danger of being invaded by United States at this moment because they have nukes and they have delivery capability. So that's the difference.
No, I agree, but I would just say the reaction and the U.S. aggression then requires the aggressor, the recipient country, the country on the receiving end of the aggression, like North Korea, to divert more finite resources into that defensive posture that could be going to help, the North Korean people. And at the same time, the aggressor country, the U.S. government, the U.S. ruling class, as it were, is doing, is spending far more money on being the aggressor and, creating an entirely new generation of weapons that can kill, everyone on Earth. So yeah, I don't disagree.
And U.S. actually had planned in the past 3 times to nuke China. First
Right.
During the Korean War, and then in 1954 during the first Taiwan Strait crisis, and then in 1958 during the second Taiwan Strait crisis. Those three time instances are what we know of because leaks from from whistleblowers like Daniel Ellsberg. So we know, and they had those plans to nuke China those 3 times, because back then China didn't have nukes. Then China had their own nukes in 1964, so they have to think twice.
Okay, over to you, Quanta.
Thank
You're
you.
next.
Thank you very much. I really do appreciate the point that is being made, that what can we do as citizens? And I think currently it's not like 1960s and 70s where there is a collective effort, consolidated effort by all peace activists coming together and make their presence be, very, very visible in Washington or even throughout the world in metro areas. So I think we are going into corners here and there, and we're all talking, and but action is needed, and action in a large scale in Washington, D.C., Chicago, and all these big places, and in Europe as well. So what can we do to, after giving people the information, what about inspiration to action? Thank you.
Christian, you want to take that? I mean, I think the first step, obviously, to get in the information out. I mean, the one of the problem is that the military-industrial complex had gotten a lot better to counter the counter-war narrative. Because back in the 1970s, there was a large, broad-based anti-war coalition because they're drafting everybody's kids to go to Vietnam. And now, the U.S. concentrate on its so-called volunteer force. So majority of the population is not being affected. And the 3-letter agency is also a lot better at infiltrating and co-opting all the opposition. But what we can do, for a start, is to get the information out, to challenge and dispel all this information campaign. And then the next step, I agree, should be organization. There should be organized opposition to the war efforts of the military-industrial complex.
And I'd just say that the organization, a large part of it can be a U.S. working class that understands the class nature of society and allies across races, across the racial divide in this country. Once that happens, the U.S. working class is 99.9% of the country. And it's a matter of numbers. I mean, the U.S. ruling class is rightfully terrified of the U.S. working class and the poor in this country. And as soon as we reject artificial divisions of race in particular, and understand that our neighbors are not our enemies, and that's when we really rally. And there's enough information out there, and we continue, like Carl said, to write and to put more information out there. I think there's a greater awakening that is taking place than my pessimistic self wants to acknowledge. And there is plenty of reason to be optimistic, as long as we keep our nose to the grindstone and keep getting after it.
Yeah, I mean, the potential is already here. Right now, the vast majority of Americans are already getting sick and tired of the lies told by mainstream media. I mean, it's just now, they're trying to, the ruling class still try to divide us, right? To distract us. Now it's our job to stay focused and to laser focus on the issue that got us here into the present predicament, which is the predominance of the military-industrial complex over all aspects of our lives, and we should demand infrastructure. We should demand better education for our children. We should demand the government actually do what it's supposed to do, rather than for running for the profit of the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, and let me add something about the War Industry Resistors Network that is sponsoring this webinar. We've been around for about 2 years, and what brought us together is 40 plus local coalitions. It's local people. I live in Asheville, North Carolina. We have a local group here that shows up against a local defense contractor that's built a plant here, Raytheon. In Boston, there's the anti-Raytheon coalition that shows up in Boston on the streets with demonstrations, trying to raise people's awareness, and then sometimes civil disobedience. We've done civil disobedience here and gotten lots of press for it here in Asheville. And of these 40 organizations around the country, we've had a couple large mobilizations where we've asked people to go out and do things all within a given week, like Tax Week or Earth Day week. And I want to say that one of the things when people go, what can we do? What can we do? There are national mobilizations. There's one in New York City coming up about climate change, September 17th, the March to End Fossil Fuels. There are these large national mobilizations, but I think we had better also have local mobilizations. And I encourage you, wherever you live, if you know a group of people and if you have a war contractor in your vicinity, which undoubtedly you do, and you can ask Christian to identify it for you if you need help, to show up on their doorstep and to call them out, to take action. It does wonders for educating people, and it also does wonders for lifting our spirits that we can actually have an impact. So that's my pitch about local action. I'm seeing the time at 9:20. Maybe we can go for another 10 minutes or 15. I see 4 hands raised, and let's call it quits after these 4 right here. And so David Copper, you're next.
Yeah, that's, am I unmuted?
You are, you're good. Whoop, now you're muted. You're muted now, David.
Yeah, I would like to thank the 2 speakers, Carl and Christian. I liked all your information, and thanks for the little humor thrown in there. And the modernization of the American nuclear program is going full forward, as Christian said. I remember back in the back in the mid 60s, they talked about using a tactical weapon to dig the canal in Nicaragua. I think Panama was up in arms about something, and fortunately that was voted down. One of the Democrats, Marianne Williamson, when she ran last time, she talked about creating a Department of Peace. And wouldn't that be a kick in the buns? You know, with the MAGA people, come out in droves to protest that. I wonder, but also that we've seen in our past, millions of people, 1 million people in the street, no effect whatsoever. Like my friend was talking about, Third Act is a group of seniors over 60. And they've been blocking traffic in Washington, and I had the honor to do that not too long ago. And I don't know. We have to get their attention. That it's like, okay, the militarization of the police force. That's to keep those old folks out of the street, I guess. But again, thank you for your presentation. It was well. I learned a lot. I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, David. 3 more questions. Looks like David and Jan. Oh, Hartso. Okay, good. Go ahead, David. You're muted, David.
Thanks very much to both of you for your excellent presentations. As you've said, we are really marching toward a nuclear war with China as quickly as we can. And what do you see as it was similar to the earlier question, but how do we step away from the brink? What can we all do, and what can the world do? This is, I mean, the lives of all of us are at stake, as you know.
I was listening to John Mearsheimer talking about this. I tend to agree with him. I think as long as the U.S. government is not going to push the Taiwan independence button, the risk of war with China is relatively low, because that if Taiwan declare formal independence, yes, there's a very high probability of war breaking out. But as long as the U.S. do not push the button, I think the two sides more likely to settle into a Cold War situation where U.S. will use the hybrid warfare, which is informational warfare. They will wage economic warfare, which is what they're doing right now against China, to keep the tension up so the military-industrial complex can sell more weapons. That's my take. I don't think it's their intention to blow up the world right now. What do you think, Christian?
I agree with what you just said, but I would also add that there's room to maneuver and room for optimism here in the United States with the unionization across racial lines that I mentioned, but also overseas governments, London, Canberra, Berlin to a certain extent, they follow Bern. They follow the U.S. government's lead on these things, and they're client states in that sense. And there's room for rift, for maneuver over there between the ruling classes in those countries, in addition to the ruling classes in South Korea and in Japan, and their respective poor and working classes in those countries who have a better understanding of history than the American public, and who are tired of being dragged into more and more U.S.-led conflict. And so there's optimism there. There's room to maneuver there. And I would also say, can we stop being afraid? What are we afraid of? What are we afraid of here in the United States? We already live in the dystopia. It's already here. I mean, they can't kill us all. They can't imprison us all. It's like, what are we so scared of? The U.S. ruling class is the worst, greediest bunch of horrible people ever assembled. I mean, and they're leading us down to it's just like, what are we scared of? Stop being afraid. We have to stop being afraid. And I'll leave it to people on the local and state level to take their own initiative. But it's just like, we got to stop being afraid and start loving one another as we rally as a class. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, and it's right. So two more questions, it looks like. Josh Teller or...
Hey, Josh Telfer, thank you. I appreciate you guys giving context and everything. So it's been really interesting. My question is, so it sounds like the solution is for everybody to stop being afraid at once. And my question is, like, human history demonstrates that people are incapable of doing that, or so far have been. So like, what is a realistic proposal to de-escalate arms races in situations like this? I mean, it's a common thing with humanity. Proxy wars have been going on since the beginning of time. So, what is the realistic proposal and steps to de-escalate arms races and to stop human conflict? Over.
So I would say, first of all, let's establish democracy in the United States. Let's establish democracy in the United States. Okay? And then we get rid of the U.S. ruling class that hates you anyway, hates you. You're a pawn to them. So we establish democracy, and then we'll have a referendum. And that referendum for the American public will decide, do you want to try to pry Taiwan off of mainland China? Do you want to send your sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers to go and fight that war? We have the connection right now through the internet to everyone on this planet. We are connected. It's a handful of people who hate you, Josh. They don't care about you. So let's establish democracy in the United States, and then we'll see where it goes.
And another reason, talking about de-escalating tensions, I think it's very easy. Just don't be a dick. Just don't be a dick in your international relations. I mean, right now it's the U.S. that's being a dick. The U.S. and China actually had a productive relationship for a while. From late 1970s all the way till I say early 2000. And what really changed was, as Christian mentioned, around the first Obama administration, under Hillary Clinton. This is when I guess the Hillary Democrats had decided they're going to pivot. They're going to pivot to being the national security Democrat. They want to take the national security issue away from the Republicans. So they're going to be fully backing the Pentagon, and that's how the pivot to Asia happened. And pivot to Asia was not a economic pivot. It's not pivoting U.S. investment into the region. It's pivoting military deployment, military postures, and that of course that's going to raise tension. I mean, if we could just go back to the pre-2008 level of relationship with China, things will be fine. But it's really easy choice to make. But right now, for whatever reason, our ruling class is not choosing to do that. They're choosing a course of confrontation. And from the Chinese side, it's not China that's aiming for confrontation with the United States. They just want to do business. They will do business with whoever wants to do business with them. And so the question really, it's really the U.S. that's right now that's stirring up the tension. So as Christians pointed out, the problem lays in our ruling class. What the hell is wrong with them? Somebody need to slap them into their senses or replace them.
Okay, I'm getting a lot of good quotes out of this session tonight, I want to say. I'm going to quote you, Carl and Christian. Okay, hey, John, you have the last question here. You're muted. Still muted, John.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
You got, okay. I want to thank the panel for their insights on the Mickey Mat. I think that comes from Ray McGovern, if I'm not mistaken. There is a quote from Upton Sinclair. It's hard to make someone understand something when their livelihood depends on their not understanding it. And I think the insight from that quote leads me to take issue with what Christian is saying about the small minority of psychopathic CEOs. We're not dealing with a small minority here. We're dealing with millions of people whose livelihoods depend upon their work with the weapons industry. Now, I'm a fully retired but still absent-minded psychology professor. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about social psychology and the fundamental attribution error.
Hang on a second, John, let's, if you can pose, instead of giving that talk, maybe you can write something in the chat. Can we?
I will, okay.
Give a question to Christian? Maybe that is your question about the many people whose livelihoods depend on this.
Yeah. I think it may be a mistake to rely too much on the rhetoric of calling the CEOs psychopaths and using psychiatric labels to explain what's going on with those folks.
Thank you.
That's what I wanted to say.
No, I appreciate that. That's it's important. Labels are important. I said sociopaths, and I believe there's a distinction. I believe psychopaths a little harsher, but I am not a trained physician or clinician. In terms of people, so I imagine you're referring to the people who are employed by the U.S. war industry. Is that it?
People who are employed by corporations that are manufacturing weapons.
Yeah. Okay.
People who are in uniform who are trained to operate those weapons.
All right. So let me take that one by one. The jobs of the U.S. war industry are about a third of what they were in the Cold War. Just like every other industry, the U.S. ruling class is exporting your job, sending it overseas where they can, including to India and Mexico. Okay. And they automate the rest. Okay. And as anybody who's worked in a factory can tell you, the pay is a little bit better in the war industry, but only for those who have or particularly for those who have advanced degrees. Engineers, physicists, they make the real big bucks, okay? Mm-hmm. And as anybody who's seen the unions unite and they work together. But there are several polls that indicate that unions, particularly the machinist unions and some of the shipbuilders, they have no problem as long as they have their job. And that could be a federal jobs guarantee during the transition, or it could be, building ships for anything. As long as they have their job, that's what they care about. And you mentioned uniform, people in uniform. People join the U.S. military, and this, according to the Pentagon's own statistics, people join the U.S. military for economic reasons. They are there, for a steady paycheck, for healthcare. They are there for loan repayment. They're there for college tuition. They're there for in-service tuition assistance and many other things that the U.S. the military recruiters dangle. So it is an economic decision. They're not there primarily for patriotism, although they do occasionally wrap their decision to enlist in the flag. But that's particularly why we need to be so effective in mobilizing, because we need to acknowledge and understand that this is an economic decision, and that if the U.S. ruling class actually cared for the American public by investing in education, lowering the cost of education, taking it out of corporate hands, and addressing the nature of the corporation itself, there are a lot of steps that the U.S. Public can take if we lived in a democracy. And so our goal is to establish democracy in this country. There's no democracy in the workplace, and there's no democracy at the ballot box. We are allowed to vote, absolutely, but you get your choice from two parties that, particularly these days, are controlled by big business interests. And with regard to labels, I'm going to continue to call them sociopaths, because that's the behavior that they demonstrate again and again and again. The criteria that I listed are the sociopathic criteria. That is the behavior of the top corporate executives, and that is a result of the structure of absolutely having to maximize short-term profit. I mean, I'm sorry if I offend a CEO's, feelings, but I think, John, you and I are on the same page that we need to be better with messaging, but we also need to understand that from a jobs perspective, the jobs are going down because they're exporting and automating as many as possible anyway. And so either we rally now, or we get continually stuck with, fewer and fewer jobs and worse hours. And, the key is unionization across racial lines as a working class, and, learning to love your neighbor in the process. But the sociopath at the top is not our neighbor. That's all.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, Ben. Carl, do you have maybe a last word to offer for the webinar?
Are we done? Are we wrapping up? No, I guess I don't have anything. I mean, I think if there's anyone have a specific question, I'll respond to that, but I don't have anything.
Okay. Or did you
prepare
have
a speech,
to add
sorry.
to what Christian just said about the response about the war economy? Actually, maybe you want to say something about that.
Well, I mean, because right now what U.S. government is doing is military cleansing, because they are rather than investing in infrastructure, rather than investing in education, they just do what's easiest, what come natural for them, which is continue to feed the war machine. but it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, U.S. is, they group everything until this national security umbrella, but U.S. homeland is incredibly secure. It has two modes, Pacific Ocean and Atlantic Ocean. This is, so right now we are really talking about the overreach of the U.S. empire in Europe, in East Asia, in Africa. It doesn't have to be that way. And I think a lot of the Americans today are already aware of the problem, because we are all dealing with high inflation, dismal job prospect for our youth. But we instead the two parties, they're just dividing us on social issues, because it's easy for them to take a stand on divisive social issues to distract us from the real problem, which is this is a dysfunctional system. This is a dysfunctional system that's not working out for the majority of the people, and it's time for us to wake up and demand change.
Yeah. And I just wanted to add that we have the issue of people being invested in the war economy. We've actually addressed that in our webinars, some of our webinars along the way. And we've had 2 webinars at least that have explicitly spoken about the conversion of the war economy, and how that's possible, how it's happening in some places. And, people's jobs can be protected. And you can get more jobs, actually, if you stop investing in the military industrial complex and invest in things like health and education and infrastructure and all that clean energy. And that's research. We know that. So maybe I think that we're ending on a good note here. Brian Garvey, I saw that you wanted to have a word here. Do you want to speak up?
I was just responding to Carl because he was asking for a cue, but I don't think he really needed it. The question was on my mind, though. I just put in the chat. It seems like our diplomats are not doing the job. I wonder if there are opportunities for citizen diplomacy. They're trying to demonize China and the Chinese people. I think the best way to combat that is for our people to meet each other and realize that we are not the monsters that our governments make us out to be. I would love to see more of that. I didn't know if Carl, if you had any knowledge of programs like that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that people's to people exchange are the best to dispel a lot of these war propaganda, and I highly encourage people to go, visit China. I mean, when seeing is believing. I think, like, if all you read about China is what the corporate media is printing out, you're getting a very distorted picture. And I'm hoping, there's more Americans travel outside their borders to see the world. It's the world is a wonderful place, and it's not full of dangers. And that's all I got to say.
That's another quote I'm taking from you. Okay, well, this has been fabulous. And let me thank you both, Christian and Carl. And you may not realize it, folks, but Carl, it's morning for Carl. He's calling in from Bali, Indonesia. So thank you for being part of this from across the world there, Carl. We're going to call it quits. I want to remind you that we have another webinar coming up September 27th. And Paul brought that up at the beginning of our webinar. It's about lobbyists and think tanks, pushing us into war. I also want to mention that we are in the works of creating we have webinars scheduled for the next couple of months, and we're in the works of creating another webinar about China because it's such a huge, crucial issue. And KJ No has agreed to be with us in the beginning of November. If you know who he is, you can Google him, NOH. KJ No. Is that how you say his name, Carl? Is it No or Noi? I've heard both. Yeah, okay. So anyway, so thank you all for being here. It's been a long session. It's been a really rewarding and educational session. Appreciate you all. Appreciate Carl and Christian. And let's keep at it, folks. Peace to all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carl.